Hello, I'm Daniel Prusalidis. Welcome to The Long Way, a podcast of short episodes with long perspectives on building the common good. Hello, I'm Daniel Prusalidis, Director of Communications at Cardus, a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to clarifying and strengthening, through research and dialogue, the ways in which society's institutions can work together for the common good. This is another special podcast episode diving into an issue that's always controversial: limiting personal freedoms. During a pandemic that's dragged on for almost 2 years, such controversies have become divisive, bitter disagreements. We've seen the results: trucker protests, ugly social media rhetoric, and defiance of public health orders, even by some houses of worship. While public health orders have affected all areas of society, including education, business, and our social lives, they've also affected religious expression and gatherings. So how well have authorities upheld religious freedom in Canada during the pandemic? How well have religious communities understood and exercised religious freedom? Cardus has stepped into this polarized debate with a new report, Reasonable Limits: How Far Does Religious Freedom Go in Canada?, by University of Saskatchewan law professor Dwight Newman. To find a way through the extremes on either side of this issue, let me throw things over to Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, the Director of Cardus Religious Freedom and Faith Community Engagement. He'll have an extended conversation with Kristopher Kinsinger, a Cardus NextGEN Fellow, an Ontario lawyer, and the National Director of the Runnymede Society.
So it's a pleasure to have with me my good friend and Cardus NextGEN Fellow, Kristopher Kinsinger, to have this conversation about reasonable limits on religious freedom. Is there such a thing? What do we mean by limits? What do we mean by reasonable? And so I'm really glad to be with you today. Chris, you've, in the last little while, you've written some blazing op-eds in Canadian newspapers on questions related to limits on religious freedom during this pandemic we've been experiencing for the last 2 years. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you for having me on, Father Deacon, and thank you for that glowing endorsement of some of what I've written. It's certainly, there's been no shortage of grist for the mill these last 2 years as we think about religious freedom and how, as a country, our understanding of religious freedom has evolved in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Why don't we start right there? In the past 2 years, there have been obviously a fairly broad array of restrictions that have been brought in to address the spread of the pandemic. And different jurisdictions across the country have brought in different restrictions. And those restrictions have impacted faith communities in a variety of different ways, but it's been quite an asymmetrical application and effect. And of course, it does raise this question of, have these restrictions been reasonable, these limits that have been placed on freedom of religion? But looking back, 2 years prior to the pandemic, we certainly had similar debates around what constitutes reasonable limits on religious freedom. Certainly, the Quebec secularism law comes to mind, the whole kerfuffle over the Canada Summer Jobs program attestation that the federal government brought in some years ago. What would you say has been the change kind of from those earlier debates we were having around reasonable limits on religious freedom? And what would you say has changed in these last 2 years?
I think when we look back during COVID and we look at the nature of the restrictions that have been placed on freedom of religion and other associated freedoms, the distinction at what comes before, often pre-COVID, you would see these limits being placed with regard to religious content. And there was often some sort of ideological tension there. And so we saw that with the Canada Summer Jobs attestation kerfuffle, as you and the Prime Minister referred to it as. But there was very clearly this sort of ideological tension and a tension of values. With COVID, there's not as evident of a tension of values because in principle, the restrictions that were being applied were for public health reasons. It had nothing to do with the content of religion. but with the nature of how physical religious gatherings could result in the spread of this virus from person to person, not having anything to do with why the people were gathered, but just simply the fact that they were gathered. But I think with that, we've seen perhaps an unhealthy erosion of the culture surrounding Section 1 of the Charter and the notion of reasonable limits. And some of that was there before, to be sure. But I think there's been at times people who have been commenting on reasonable limits during the pandemic have taken a very superficial approach and have simply said, well, it's a pandemic, so the limit is therefore reasonable, as if that's where the conversation stops. Yes, Section 1 of the Charter does give the state and the government a fair bit of leeway when it comes to restricting and limiting charter guarantees during a public emergency such as a pandemic. But that is not where the analysis needs to end. There still has to be a robust analysis. And so I think for me, that's where this has been most worrying at times, is how the public discourse has gone, and a failure to grapple with the ways in which different charter guarantees may be distinct, and how limiting freedom of religion is different than perhaps placing limits on other activities that may or may not have constitutional protection.
Right. For example, so the freedom to go to, we're in Ontario, so the freedom to go to the LCBO to pick up a bottle of wine is not guaranteed under the Charter. That is not a fundamental freedom, whereas, of course, freedom of conscience and religion is in Section 2A. But just what you said there, Chris, it raises for me two issues. The first issue is, again, hearkening back to maybe some of the limits we saw through the Canada Summer Jobs Attestation, the secularism law in Quebec. Those limits didn't really impact the act of public worship. That still seemed to be sacrosanct. Mm-hmm. And the state, for whatever policy goal, was not invading that space per se. Now, I think we can all agree that civil authorities do have a role when it comes to public worship. So, for example, we already accept such reasonable limits as fire codes. Yep. And, a church or a synagogue or a gurdwara can only have so many people. Otherwise, it becomes an issue of security and certainly of risks to life and limb. So I think we can all accept that. So there's that issue of how these limits come to restrict public worship. Mm-hmm. And then the related other issue seems to be, are we dealing with civil authorities, public health officials, and so forth, who, when they impose these limits, really are rather ignorant on the nature of the activities of faith communities, particularly public worship, and why public worship is so important, especially for those communities that have what we'll call sacramental worship, where they come together for services of communion or similar types of things that you can only do collectively, not virtually. So maybe why don't we comment on those two issues? Maybe the first one is, now these limits seem to be impinging more on worship itself, and that seems to be a bit of a shift. What's your take on that? It's
very interesting to think that, pre-COVID, the idea that governments would restrict the ability of churches and other religious communities to gather for worship in such a significant way, it would have seemed absurd if you had said this to me, pre-December 2019, that this was going to happen, that for 2+ years, there would be significant restrictions placed on the ability of a church to gather as a full body. I probably wouldn't have believed you. And then almost overnight, that changed. And you're right that before there were some of these limits in place, such as fire code capacities. If you want to use another extreme example, churches can't just meet in a dilapidated warehouse where there's risk that the entire building is going to collapse on the congregants. And we would all agree that that's a reasonable limit on the freedom to gather in religious worship. But then COVID happens, and we see this shift. And I don't know if we quite realized the extent of that shift and just how significant that was. Now, that's not to say, especially in the early days of the pandemic, that there may not have been cause to limit the size of religious gatherings as with other gatherings. But again, we seem to have fallen headlong in some ways into this new normal, and without stopping to kind of pick that apart, it's going to be interesting to see how we come out of that. And thankfully, we're starting to see these restrictions across Canada being lifted. But there's a real conversation that the church and other religious communities need to have right now about what we take away from all of this, and how we conceive of our own, civic freedom to gather and worship. Because this may not be the last time this happens. There may be other pandemics, and who knows? We're witnessing disruption of public order in many ways right now. Could this be setting the ground for other limits on peaceful assemblies? It remains to be seen.
Well, you have, of course, brilliantly anticipated the recommendations in our paper that Dwight Newman wrote for us on this question of reasonable limits. And one of those recommendations relates back to what I was saying earlier, and that is, how do we ensure that faith communities and the civil authorities, the highly secularized civil authorities, that they are engaging on an ongoing basis, not just within a time of crisis, such as we've been experiencing? Because again, it seems that, as I said at the beginning, there's a wide kind of asymmetry of approaches that different provinces have taken in terms of imposing restrictions on religious worship. Certainly in our own province of Ontario, although the capacity levels have been fluctuating, the number of people that can attend religious worship has been shifting throughout the past 2 years. For all intents and purposes, places of worship have been able, if they choose to, have been able to be open since June of 2020. But that has not been the case in provinces such as British Columbia, or even most recently in Quebec, where Quebec shut down all places of public worship just after Christmas through the month of January and into the beginning of this month of February 2022. So how do we, in the desire of having an ongoing dialogue and having this ongoing relationship between faith communities and government, how do we, first of all, ensure that our civic authorities, our public health officials, other officials are well informed about what faith communities do, why they do it, how they do it, and that they do it in very different ways. So there's an asymmetry, obviously, within types of public worship. Sikh worship is not the same as Jewish worship, is not the same as Catholic worship, and is not the same as evangelical Protestant worship. So how do you convey that? And then secondly, how do you really try and ensure that faith communities also understand that there are such things as reasonable limits, that there's the exercise of that wonderful virtue of prudence, that, distancing and masking is not such an unreasonable limit. So how do we sort of ensure those things? How do we ensure that dialogue grows and develops? Because obviously it's been a bit of a scattershot approach across the country.
I think there are two parts to my answer to that question. And the first part kind of goes back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, which is, you alluded that the government often and government leaders and policymakers don't often understand religious communities. And as someone who, as a deacon at my church, and who was helping to navigate all of these regulations as they were coming out, one of the things that frustrated me when I was reading the Ontario regulations was that it became very evident that the people who wrote them had no idea what goes on in a church service or in a religious service. And so entire categories, it was very artificial. And you would try to, for example, take a youth group meeting, and you would try to figure out where that falls within the regulations. And it was not made clear at all where that fell. And so I think as a start, we need to respectfully and in a constructive way, we need to make sure that policymakers are listening to religious communities and understand that they need to be actively consulting with religious communities as they draft, God forbid, but if there's another public emergency of this nature, as they draft regulations in response, we need to make sure that they are actually applicable to churches and places of worship as they conduct their activities. So, that's the first part. But then, yes, I think there's also this second part where we need to help those, and I'm speaking specifically now for Christians within the church, understand the nature of religious freedom and understand why, as Christians, we value religious freedom and other associated freedoms, such as freedom of peaceful assembly and expression and the like. And I think there's a need here to move away from some of the more superficial and simplistic understandings of freedom that often arise and that often we see thrown around, especially on social media, where it's a very all or nothing sort of understanding of freedom, and to step back and to say, well, no, freedom isn't an all or nothing proposition. There are restrictions that are placed on our freedom all the time. Again, we go back to fire codes. That's a minimalist example. So we need to have prudence, and we need to be able to recognize that there may be times when there are reasonable limits, yes, that are placed on freedom. So you mentioned masking and distancing as two potential examples of that. But beyond that, this is going to help Christians and other people of faith be more articulate in terms of how they express why they do what they do is valuable and distinct from other activities. And again, I mentioned here, we're not just dealing with freedom of religion, we're dealing with other associated freedoms. So a religious gathering is not only different from going to the LCBO or something of that nature, it may also be different from other types of peaceful assemblies. You know, there's an argument to be made here that coming together for a community hockey game would be protected by Section 2C of the Charter as a peaceful assembly. But I think it's also fair to say that a religious gathering is still distinct from that, because it also engages the Section 2A guarantee of religious freedom. And so when we look to Section 1 and we think about the nature of reasonable limits, I think we also have to be mindful of how multiple guarantees that are being exercised simultaneously can have this sort of compounding effect. And so as Christians, we need to find a way to articulate that to policymakers and to those in positions of civic authority that helps them to understand that we are trying to exercise these freedoms in a way that matters, and that it matters in terms of how our law has been drafted, that these freedoms, that we recognize the ways in which they are distinct and we recognize why they are important.
And how we articulate what we do as faithful people to public authorities, there's a particular way of doing that, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I think often we find ourselves, because we're conscious of the secularization that is around us and that we're dealing with, in many cases, people that are very secular and maybe don't have a full understanding of the role of faith and so forth, especially in our public life. But sometimes we can engage in a bit of a us versus them, where the government doesn't understand us, and so we have to adopt this somewhat combative stance. And religious freedom is an all or nothing; it's a zero-sum game, and that certainly is not productive. So, how then? What is the right sort of disposition for faith communities when they're engaging government, and how can we communicate with government in a way that is, first of all, strategic, but also in a way that is, let's say, formative, where we help government to understand, here's who we are. Because I think for a very long time, especially as Christians, we've assumed too much. We've assumed that the people we're speaking to when we're engaging government on a whole range of issues understand who we are. And I think we need to adopt a bit of a different approach. So what would you say to that? I mean, how would we adopt a more strategic engagement of civil authority in a way that is going to be well received and is going to foster the greater dialogue that we call for in Dwight's paper?
As a start, as Christians, I think we can look to the exhortations in Scripture to pray for those in positions of authority and to give honor to those in positions of authority. So that's the starting point. Is we can't fall into this sort of anti-statist position where we look at the civil magistrate, to use the language of Scripture, as our enemy. We need to look to them, to those in positions of civil authority, as being ministers of God, because that's what Scripture says. So I think that's our starting point, that we want to work with rather than against. And then to help civil authorities understand Christians and the church, we need to articulate our shared values. So within the context of the pandemic, as a good example, I think we can say, we share your desire to protect people. We don't want people to get sick. We don't want people to die because of this virus. So we want to do what we can to help further public health, but we want to do so in a way that also recognizes the inherent value of what we are doing. And so at that stage, it comes, there's need to be winsome and persuasive in demonstrating why a religious gathering is, going back to what I said a few moments ago, distinct from something like, say, a community hockey game. That's not to say that, community gatherings aren't important, but to say that to the life of a person of faith, gathering in a faith-based community and partaking of religious rites and sacraments is crucial to that aspect of their identity. And to deny that has a very adverse effect on who they are as a person. And so as part of that is, one of the things that Professor Newman discusses in his report for Cardus is the Oakes test and the nature of the Oakes test. And so one of the points that I made in a recent editorial in the National Post, and this is a point I originally made about a year ago, is with the nature of proportionality, the balance can shift over time. And so one thing that I think the church can be doing when it comes to COVID is to be saying, as the longer restrictions on religious gathering are imposed, and the longer we have to deal with this, the cost on people of faith and religious communities is only going to grow greater. And presumably, if some of these measures work, and I think there is compelling evidence that they have to an extent, the relative benefit of the measures is going to decrease. And so even if we say at the outset of the pandemic or a year into the pandemic that the reasonable limits test has been met under Section 1, that's not necessarily going to be the case forever. And so we also need to be in a posture where we're able to engage in an ongoing dialogue. And that's going to require humility, and it may require some situations in which believers have to say, I don't, as a matter of wisdom, agree with what's being imposed here. We may think that it's too onerous, but ultimately we also have to recognize that we are not the ones who've been given this authority over the public health of the nation, and that those who wield authority are going to be accountable for that authority. So I think adding a healthy dose of humility into that as well would go a long way in terms of how, as the church, we relate to the civil authorities.
Well, this raises this question of you're talking about the shifting nature of proportionality and the proportional response with the state imposing these limits, and that can shift over time. And I want to bring up the situation in Quebec where the imposition of not only vaccine mandates to gain access to public worship. And that was imposed without caveat in Quebec at the end of last year. And then the complete shuttering of places of public worship, as I mentioned, the beginning of 2022, and that has just been lifted just a couple of weeks ago. We're now in mid-February 2022. What we're dealing with in February 2022 is not what we were dealing with in March of 2020, where we now have upwards of 80% of the population fully vaccinated in the province of Quebec. We have seen that the various measures that were brought in, what we might call reasonable restrictions, have had a desired effect. But now we're seeing, obviously, across the board, as you say, provinces sort of competing to see who can eliminate the restrictions the fastest. And now the province of Quebec has, again, to their credit, removed the imposition of vaccine passports for public worship. But given that issue of proportionality, and obviously citizens are observing what's going on, that something is very different, especially around vaccination rates between now in 2022 and what we were dealing with in March 2020, where there were a lot of unknowns. When do you hit a red line, would you say? When do you hit a red line where that proportionality has gone out the window and really the restrictions are imposing an unrealistic burden upon people in terms of limiting and restricting their rights? Where do you hit that red line, and how do you determine that? When does a limit become unreasonable? I mean, we've got the Oakes test, certainly, but just from a sort of the man in the street perspective, I think there's a lot of common sense where people say, and I think, we see people across the country that are sort of saying enough is enough. How do we recognize that reality when we're dealing with a legal concept such as reasonable limits?
I think as a starting point, it's healthy when we earlier on in our discussion, we talked about the culture surrounding Section 1. So I think it's good for us to think more broadly about Section 1 beyond the confines of the Oakes test. And that's not to say that the Oakes test doesn't have its uses, but one of the points that's been made by legal scholars such as Derek Ross and Brian Bird is that Section 1 not only provides a basis on which to limit rights and freedoms, but it also serves to guarantee those rights and freedoms. And that's what the language of Section 1 says. And Brian Bird in particular has noted that we assume that that Section 1 states that all rights and freedoms may be subject to reasonable limits, but that's not actually what it says. It lays out the standard by which rights and freedoms may be subject to reasonable limits. So there may be certain rights and freedoms that may never be subject to reasonable limits, and those that we have seen can be subject to reasonable limits, like religious freedom. That doesn't also mean that there aren't going to be situations in which certain types of restrictions are never justified. So when we think about a red line, I think this is again where it's helpful for believers and for the church to be able to articulate degrees of restriction and why it's different to, for example, say to a church, you have to gather at 25% capacity or 50% capacity, versus telling a church that they need to require proof of vaccination from everyone who walks in the door. And that's where we need to be very strategic and very nuanced in what we're articulating here, because one of the things that we've done throughout the pandemic is we've made comparisons between places of worship and other similar settings, such as movie theaters and the like. So we need to be able to say to civil authorities, okay, this is why it's not okay to expect proof of vaccination from someone attending a church versus someone going to the movies. Because the big line that's been crossed there, in my view, is that by saying that those who come into the church and participate in its worship must produce proof of that vaccination, you're setting a standard by which the state is effectively excommunicating, albeit perhaps temporarily, certain members of the church. And there's just no comparison between that and, say, going to a movie theater. And again, I think we can make a similar argument when it comes to total prohibitions on places of worship, and to say, are there not ways that we can, make accommodations, right? That we can have, perhaps a hard cap set on gatherings that nevertheless still allows people to gather. And I myself, my own church, about a year ago, when we were in one of our lockdowns, when we couldn't have these big in-person gatherings, we would regularly have small gatherings of 10 people, and we would have numerous gatherings throughout the week. It's not ideal, but it's still recognizing that there is a core value to physically being together in person and coming together in person, and recognizing that. And not all faith traditions would necessarily take this stance, but many within Christian denominations would say that things like the Lord's Supper cannot be administered virtually and has to be done in person. And so again, being able to accommodate that in a way and that recognizes the importance of those sorts of rites and sacraments within the life of a believer is important. And so we need to find a way to articulate that such that policymakers and those in positions of authority are going to recognize where we're coming from.
Well, it's interesting that looking at the United States during this same period, there's been a lot more litigation on religious liberty grounds. I'm thinking in particular of an early case involving Capitol Hill Baptist Church in my second home of Washington, D.C. And there's been a lot more going through the U.S. courts, challenging restrictions, challenging reasonable limits, challenging proportionality. In Canada, we haven't seen the same degree of litigiousness. There are a couple of cases going through now, including a few in your neck of the woods around sort of Kitchener-Waterloo area. Mm-hmm. What's your read on that? Why have there been fewer cases challenging the reasonable limits, challenging the limits? Are they reasonable? Are they unreasonable? Applying the Oakes test. Mm-hmm. And again, for our listeners, the Oakes test is the means. It's a somewhat controversial means at times. The means by which the question of Section 1 reasonable limits can be adjudicated. why are we not seeing the same degree of litigation in Canada? And now that restrictions are being reduced and eventually, hopefully eliminated, what's the future of any sort of litigation that might come forward? Will it be sort of nostalgic? What's your sense of where we might be going?
It's interesting you raise Capitol Hill Baptist. I was in DC back in November, and quite unplanned, I went there in the evening, and I had an opportunity to meet afterwards with their lead pastor, Mark Dever, and to meet with some of the other brothers who are associated with that church, such as Jonathan Lehman. And I do think David French wrote a really great article last year just talking about the wisdom that particular church showed in how they approached the litigation. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that, because we do have to be very strategic as Christians and as the church when we engage in litigation. There's a need to remember that we need to be good litigants. And so we need to be sympathetic litigants. And so how we approach the buildup to litigation matters just as much as the litigation itself. And you mentioned that there's litigation that's gone on here in Ontario, and I won't name specific churches, but I do think at times we have seen perhaps a lack of wisdom in how litigation is approached, because again, going back earlier in our conversation, that there's been an approach to these issues that is very all or nothing. The sense that if my religious freedom or my freedom of peaceful assembly is being limited even a little bit, that this is unconscionable. And so when churches refuse to abide by any kind of limitation and then go try to litigate, that can create problems. And it shouldn't be the case that only sympathetic litigants succeed, but the reality is this is just the nature of litigation. You need to make sure that litigants are sympathetic and that they haven't just simply engaged in these tactics of refusing to comply with any kind of limitation. So I think, in Canada, one of the reasons perhaps you didn't see as much litigation is these restrictions, when they were at their worst, they tended to come in spurts. And so we would have them for several weeks to, 2 to 3 months, and then they would be rolled back again. And so it was more difficult to ramp up litigation in time. And these restrictions, as they were imposed, many times they were extended, but they were originally envisioned as short-term policies. And so that creates a very practical question for a church of, okay, we've been complying, we've been trying to do our best, we have concerns about the constitutionality of these policies, but do we now come together or as individuals, are we going to take this enormous expense on to litigate to get possibly an additional 2, 3, 4 weeks to be able to gather together before the restrictions would have been lifted anyway. So there's a very difficult wisdom issue there. And I think if there's anything that we can kind of take away from this, is that there was perhaps a need throughout the pandemic for churches to come together a little bit more. And there are practical ways in which the expense of litigation can be shared. And if you can find churches that make for good sympathetic litigants and have them join together, there's a possibility there that these sort of challenges might have been brought where they weren't. We'll see if that happens again in the future. Hopefully the worst of the pandemic is behind us, and Lord willing, we will never have to deal with these kind of restrictions of this nature for any reason in the future. But if that day does come, and we do, there's going to need to be, I think, a coming together and a strategicness in terms of how churches approach the prospect of litigation and to seek to avail ourselves of the freedoms which our Constitution guarantees.
Well, that is wisdom indeed. So it's good. I appreciate our conversation today, Chris. And as we do move out of this time of restrictions, as March is just down the road, we look forward to continuing to exercise all of our fundamental freedoms robustly, and recognize that with those freedoms come responsibilities to be good citizens, to engage our civil authorities in a way that is respectful, and also a way that seeks to inform them about the role of faith communities. So thank you again very much for your time today. I enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure we will have many more, my fellow deacon.
Thank you, brother. As always, it was a pleasure.
That brings us to the end of this special episode. If you'd like to reach us, that's easy. Just write to media@cardus.ca. Cardus is spelled C-A-R-D-U-S. Thanks for listening.